The water. On the same side of the hemisphere, but in a faraway town from where Gigi resided in her garden, and a stranger waited in the dunes of a beach for her, a young woman who had not long discovered an exciting new land was to embark on her fourth exploration of this new world by the entrance of a dive into the ocean. Thus, this very morning, Brooke had decided that she was going back to the beach. Though it should have been the least of her worries considering her newfound fate. The young woman was worried about the coldish weather and water. Her worries about the cold were ignited about whether it was warm enough to wear a summer dress, and, as previously noted, her secondary concern was that the water would be cold. The last of the spring sunshine would not have been strong enough to warm the water up yet in these first weeks of summer. Brooke hated cold water, and to herself quipped, "I'm going to do it anyway." She shrugged and stretched her hands above her head and nodded her head resolutely. Leaving the house with gear in tow, Brooke exited left onto the footpath at the end of her driveway and onto her awaited destiny. The beach was just as she had envisioned when she arrived a few minutes later. The tide was gently easing in, and there was no breeze to make even the smallest of ripples. Brooke dropped her bag onto the sand, removed her sandals, and went to inspect the water more thoroughly. "Yup, just as I thought," she said to herself, and as expected, she could see through crystal-clear aqua-coloured water to the sand beneath. It's cold. Brooke was hoping for the water to be a little murkier, with a bit more seaweed. It would be much easier to dive into the deep, is what she had learned from experience. The girl had found it easier to plumb the depths when she felt she had something to dive into, such as seaweed. Plus, it could keep her a little warmer too. "I'm going to do it! I'm going to do it! I'm going to do it!" Brooke exhales as she shakes out her body. She sensed herself being called back into the water and back to her underwater sanctuary. Even to this day, Brooke did not understand what had occurred when she had dived into the water that first fateful day one summer ago. That particular day was just like any other day. There had been nothing out of the ordinary, just an ordinary spring morning. She had woken up to what was a typical hot day with the morning sun blaring through her window and the sounds of muffled laughter and music in the kitchen down the hallway. She turned to the clock, 5:47 in the morning. Nothing else to do but to get up and make a mango smoothie and head to the beach before it got too hot to go outside, which would happen in a few hours' time. So that is what she did after sharing familial pleasantries, along with her mango, apricot, and banana smoothie. So off Brooke trotted out the front door and up the garden pathway, out of the front gate, and making her usual left turn onto the footpath before taking the last leg onto the beach. She had walked this same path since she had begun walking and was still seeing the same brick and weatherboard houses and white picket fences with green grass and petunia flower beds. Nope, nothing unusual to see here today. Just another typical hot summer in a little seaside town where a young woman took her morning walk to the beach for her daily frolic in the ocean water. Though that would all change as Brooke tore off her beach dress as she walked on the sand and dived. Once her body hit the water and she dived into the sea, she had a sense of being drawn into the water with an instant magnetic pull and felt a hurried desire to swim deeper and faster. Instead of rising to the surface to look for oxygen, an internal sense of freedom and release overtook her, and she kicked her legs, not for a few strokes, but for meters and meters underwater, and her instinct was not to rise out of the water to draw breath, but to keep kicking. She did not know why this desire had compelled her, and only knew that her heart was beating faster than her exhilaration grew. She opened her eyes, almost by instinct, and looked, and was amazed to find herself looking at the ocean floor. Normally, the salt of the ocean would cause incessant blinking and stinging eyes, but today she could see the ocean floor and the sea creatures and seaweed floating underneath her, following her as she swam. She kept swimming, reached for her mouth, and touched her nose with her fingers and felt the skin on her face. The texture of her skin was different somehow. It felt like her skin was coated in very fine latex rubber. She touched her mouth and nose again. No oxygen was passing through there. And why did her skin feel different? Brooke's heart beat faster, but this time not because of exhilaration, but because of panic. How am I breathing? What is happening to my skin? Her heart was becoming frenetic within her chest, and she frantically looked for the surface of the water above her, and could see a little bit of light forcing its way through the green of the water, and she furiously swam upward toward it. The water's temperature had also changed around her, and she had begun to shiver as she kicked toward the surface. After what felt like an eternity, but was only seconds in reality, she found herself above water and gasping for air. With all the strength that she could muster due to her limbs feeling like jelly, and also along with her labored breathing, Brooke took a few steps to the shoreline and collapsed in the shallows, with the gentle waves moving about her. Her green eyes stared at the blue sky. While she tried to steady her own breath, she frantically touched her skin, which had returned to its normal texture. Brooke lied there for an hour, trying to make sense of what had happened as she stared at the sky. A smile came to her lips as she decided to very quickly console herself with the notion that she had had an unexplainable spiritual experience, and these happened from time to people all over the world. People had strange, unexplained, lucid spiritual experiences of all sorts, and what had occurred to her today was one of those experiences she had decided. This is what gave her consolation as she grappled with her reality. This rational explanation was not to last long in the poor girl's mind, as she had not even realized that this shoreline she was on was not Cove Beach. Upon gaining her strength and composure, Brooke pulled herself out of the shallows and stood up. Having made sense in her own mind of what had occurred, she stood and expected to stand up, turn around, and walk back home, exactly the same way that she had always done. So, Brooke turned around and did not see the 500 stretch of sand connecting to the concrete pathway, but saw sand dunes and quite large ones at that. So, then she concluded she must have swum with the tide and ended up much further along the coastline. This is a very common occurrence with beachgoers, particularly if you don't monitor where your beach markers are, which, of course, was the least on her mind during the day's fortuity. So, up the sand dunes, she climbed as a way to gain her bearings and shake off the coldness that she was beginning to feel again. To her surprise, she saw birch trees and palm trees for miles and miles, which caused her to bite her lip, and her eyes grew wide. This is not familiar territory at all. I can't have swum this far. In fact, nowhere I know has this kind of bush and scrubland. Curiosity overtook Brooke, and she found herself almost compulsively wandering down the other side of the sand dunes. Nothing seemed that different on the surface in this foreign environment than from where she had just come, except for the trees. The most remarkable difference that she had noticed was that her 5 senses were more heightened. She had never remembered her sense of smell being so strong. Was it her 5 senses that were more heightened, or was it that what she could see, smell, and hear and feel was much more elevated here? Brooke questioned this in a whisper to herself, but put it all down to the fact that she must have been running on adrenaline. Everything was so vivid here, and the colours were brighter, the smells were more pungent. She was curious about exactly where she was. What struck her was what appeared to be the apparent lack of civilization. Even on the top of this dune, trees and hills could be seen for miles, but no power lines or roads or even a township in the distance. On the other side of the sand dunes, Brooke grabbed some rocks and sticks up off the ground and placed them around a birch tree. This would be where she knew she had entered from, and continued to pick up stones and rocks to place at the base of the trees every 20 meters. There was an eerie stillness in the air, and she could not hear even a rustle of a leaf in the breeze, nor even a bird in the air, nor even a creature on the ground. And of course she felt cold too. Just at the moment she was pondering this, Brooke stopped in her tracks as she heard a rustle, and so moved as quietly as she could on the coarse sand to find the source of the sound. Upon finding the source, she stood behind a birch tree, crouched and listened. It was the sound of swift-moving human footsteps. She sucked in her breath and peered around the tree. Her eyes widened for the second time that day. Only meters away was a sight that took her breath away, again. A striking figure stood only meters away, and the strength of his presence made her crouch low behind a tree. She was acutely aware that she was still wearing only her bathers, which contributed to her timid response, and for the first time in a decade, she felt modest wearing them. She herself had never been considered a great beauty. Beautiful wasn't a descriptor commonly used to describe Brooke, and standing behind this tree, she had not felt so skinny, gangly, and plain. Her teeth were never pearly white, in fact, they were ever so slightly crooked even after years of braces. Her hair, though long and sun-bleached, was a little wiry and coarse. It certainly was never flowing. Stringy would be the more accurate assessment. Even at her age, her skin was a little sun-damaged, and lines were beginning to form around her eyes, and she certainly had no high sharp cheekbones. Her body had no real curves to speak of, but she considered herself to be angular. Her legs were skinny and her knees knobby. Though what she thought she lacked in personal appearance, she knew she possessed in boldness, but not today. She felt woefully inadequate, unlike this radiant person before her. To her eye, he appeared perfect. Brooke peered around the tree trunk to admire the figure standing side by her. With a bow and arrow poised, his eyes and face looking intensely at something in the distance, he stood so very still, positioning himself to shoot. A lock of rich brown wavy hair fell over his left eye as he shot the arrow with delicacy and what she rightly presumed was precision. Then, before she knew what happened and she could study him, he was gone, running toward whatever was the unfortunate recipient of his arrow. Despite his pale skin and fine bone structure, his presence was powerful, like a lingering expensive perfume, and his presence did linger, even after she heard his light footsteps disappear into the distance, and the aroma of his presence felt heavy around her. In this moment, she could not figure out whether his elegant appearance enhanced his pale skin and fine bone structure, or vice versa. She just knew that his presence was very heavy around her in this scrubland. For a moment, she dare not move for thinking about it. Her stomach was in knots, her heart was pounding, and her hands on the tree were shivering. Brooke felt almost ashamed of her response to this unknown person, particularly as he stood before her for such a fleeting moment. Again, she put her reactive response to him all down to the peculiarity of the day, and to the fact that her nerves had been shot more than one time that day. Brooke tried to regain internal composure. She knew she was not moving from that spot until she could not feel his presence any longer, and to her annoyance, his presence felt like it still lingered for a long time after the fact of the matter was, Brooke did not want any more surprises of any sort that day. Brooke jolted herself out of that memory of her first experience of Alaysia and the mystery person who held her presence and back to the present day, and it caused her to sigh as she thought to put those events out of her mind. She thought that she knew that he did not know of her existence, yet she was acutely aware of him, and the prospect of seeing him excited her more than the discovering of a whole new world, if that could be believed, and her heart beat faster. Brooke had spotted him occasionally for over a month now and admired his heroics from afar. She continued to remember that first encounter, and this caused a stirring within her belly. These thoughts ignited in her motivation, and it took her just a second to walk back to her gear, remove her beach top, and run down the sand and into the water, and dive deep, deep, deep into the water. As she dived into the water, none did Brooke know that she too was being watched by someone in the sand, dunes, by one who was just as acutely aware of her as she was of her own mystery love. Not being armed with this knowledge, Brooke innocently plunged deep into the seaweed, which seemed to separate and part before her as she dived. It almost felt like the seaweed was being welcomed and creating a pathway, especially for her. Maybe it was. No time to think of it now. In her eagerness, she decided to follow the parting seaweed. Her heart was beating faster, and she swam as quickly as she could. She was diving deeper and deeper as the water developed into a darker shade of blue. Her eyes were wide open too. She could see just as well as if she were on land. It had never occurred to her to ponder too long on why or how she could see underwater, let alone breathe. She was just aware that she could. Anyway, her mind was on one thing, unwrapping the mystery of the man on the other side of this body of water. So Brooke kept swimming through the seaweed pathway, which danced on either side of her, acting like a protective shield. After a while, one thing the young woman had noticed, as always, was a change of temperature in the water. She knew that she was getting closer to rising to the surface, and that land was near, because the water had felt cold like it always did when she had dived in at Cove Beach near her home. Her stomach had butterflies, and the combination of excitement and coldness of the ocean water had caused goosebumps. She continued to swim as she looked up at the surface. Her eyes blinked, and she shut them because the salt in the sea was causing them to sting. She wanted to get to the surface quickly because her lungs had returned to normal capacity, and she needed oxygen. Thankfully, her surfacing happened quickly. She gasped for air as her face hit the surface. A few hurried breaths filled her lungs and allowed her a couple of strong freestyle strokes to get herself to a place in the water in which she could stand. Despite her apparent breathlessness, Brooke knew only one thing at that moment, and that it was cold. She emerged from the water with her arms wrapped around herself and looked around the beach. The sand was still white and pristine. The sky was blue and cloudless, but the sun had no proper heat to it. She rubbed her arms, hoping to warm herself up, but to no avail. Brooke remembered that she had had this very problem on a previous occasion. She also remembered that a few swims ago she had packed herself a bag of clothes consisting of a t-shirt, a blue jumper, a pair of Kathmandu brand hiking pants, her mother's favourite pair actually, and a pair of white Vans. Now, if I could remember exactly where I put that backpack. She wringed her hair out over her left shoulder with her hands as she scanned the sand dunes. Well, I remember the birch trees and the palm trees on the other side of the dunes. I am pretty sure that I left my bag inside of an old tree trunk on the left-hand side of my current path. Brooke began her 100-metre trek until she hit the bottom of the sand dunes and climbed the 20 metres climb. The breeze picked up a little, and it was slightly chilly. She shivered again as she climbed and rubbed her arms again as she stood up on the top of the dune and looked around. So Brooke took this opportunity and scanned the horizon, and as she did, so she saw a flock of birds moving toward the water from which she had just come. The flock had formed a complete arrow. She strained her neck above her head until she could not any more, and turned her body clockwise to face the ocean and watch the marvel above her. These birds flew in perfect formation, and they made no sound at all, not even their wings as they flapped in absolute unison. Each bird was in perfect symmetry and off, and information with the bird next to them. Though the true peculiarity was that each of these birds was the exact shade of yellow, with absolutely no variation in colour or tone. Also, they were precisely the same size as one another. It was almost as if they were mechanical birds held together by invisible rods. Something else struck Brooke, and it was more of a feeling than anything else. It was a feeling that somehow these birds were communicating with her, that they were giving her a message specific to her. The girl had no clue what that message was, other than that they appeared to indicate a direction which pointed back to the ocean from which she had just emerged. All this did was incite the curiosity of Brooke to explore the land to which she had just arrived. She turned back around toward her intended destination, which was the other side of the dunes on which she stood, and continued her trek down the other side of these sand dunes. She made her way down the other side and looked about for her backpack, and sure enough, the clothes that she wanted were where she left them and nice and dry. So she changed and felt much more ready to explore the land. This inquisitive adventurer pulled a piece of chalk out of her pocket to mark the trees with numbers every 70 metres to note her way as she began her exploration. Brooke did not bother to be quiet as she walked over the twigs and stones. She had also got used to the fact that there were no well-trodden paths, and she ducked and swerved around the trees and branches, whilst trying to forge a pathway of her own that was straightforward and easy to follow for her return trip home. It would also be a pathway that she had for future use, and had decided it would be the first of many paths in the months and years to come. Carefully, she walked and walked, breaking off small branches that obstructed her path. She was grateful for their easy submission because she did not want blisters or calluses, but if she did get them, it would be worth the trouble. When she was not breaking off small twigs, she was scuffing her feet along the ground, trying to encourage the ground to help her form some tread and create a basic semblance of a track. The smell of the birch pines brought a smile to her lips. There was the smell of ocean salt and seaweed which her body was drenched in, and these odours lingered in her nostrils, and she relished the melding of the scent of nature's perfumes together. She ran her tongue across her lips, and the taste of ocean salt was still in her mouth and on her lips. Brooke was also grateful that she was not cold anymore either, as her sojourn was leading her further into the woods. It was pleasant and warm, with the sun shining brightly above her head. The distinct lack of clouds overhead probably increased this feeling of warmth, and the dunes, which were at least a kilometre behind her now, had created a barrier between her and the cool ocean air. She moved deliberately and slowly, savouring these sensations, not wanting this walk to end. She was relishing her time here. This feeling of tranquility and serenity was one she had never experienced before, and wanted to keep feeling these sensations for as long as she could. That old cliché of feeling like you could burst with joy was causing her to want to sing or even hum, though she refrained, supremely aware of her distinct lack of talent, and Brooke knew if she did, she would surely upset all of the equilibrium around her. But boy, did she want to. Maybe she could whistle. Nope, no good at that either. She gave out the smallest of exasperated sighs and continued her walk with the repetitive pattern of marking the trees and scuffing the ground, then breaking off small twigs to encourage a pathway. She realized that she was wandering aimlessly with no destination, but did not mind. Brooke was happy to keep going. She was relishing forging her path to nowhere. Her enchantment was broken some time later by way of her bladder, and her bodily need to urinate overtook her, and she looked about for a suitable tree to urinate behind. Though she was not sure why, but felt that she needed to find a tree, she felt like the only soul out there. But still, even in this solitude, her good old modesty and her inherent shyness prevailed. An oversized birch tree with a remarkably large tree trunk to squat behind was spotted, and had been picked by Brooke as a suitable urinal because of the soft heathery-like bushes next to it, which she could use to wipe herself or her hands should she need to. Plus, the position of these bushes acted like a cover or a wall around the tree. It felt almost like a toilet cubicle, and satisfied her desire for privacy. After she had positioned herself at the base of the tree trunk, but before she undid the button to her pants, she noticed in the distance a silent, shadowy type object moving in her direction, which caused her to stop undoing her pants, and instead, she stood upright, and she shaded her eyes with one arm to see a vision in the distance. She watched something moving at a slow and steady pace toward her, and it glided with effortlessness just a metre or two above the ground. At a distance, it appeared to be a shadow, but there was nothing around it that was causing a shadow to be thrown, and the dark blob represented nothing more than what seemed to be a big, oversized black cloud. It was making its way through the trees and brush like they were not there, with slow and deliberate pacing. Brooke stared, unable to take her eyes off of it, and becoming more intrigued with it every second that passed. She was willing herself to keep her wits about her. Though Brooke did not notice herself stand to attention, and her body simultaneously stiffen, nor did she notice that her own breathing was slowly but steadily, and without rhythmic timing. Her breath was surely and steadily becoming heavy, laboured and shallow, like there was breath stuck in her throat, and that she could not quite get the oxygen into her breathing cavity. She did not notice the atmospheric pressure increase around her, which was contributing to these new breathing patterns. With every inhalation, the air was like a fork full of food that was too thick to chew, ingest, and digest in one bite. She continued standing on the spot as though in a trance, unable to move except for her chest rising and falling. To Brooke, this did not feel like a trance, though. Well, I don't think so. At least, I've never been in one. What she knew, though, was that she knew her body was frozen in position, most likely from fear of a panic attack that would account for her erratic breath, too. But I have had one of those before, and this doesn't feel like that, though. Somewhere in the crevices of her mind, she was aware of the stillness and quiet hush about her, and this quietness was almost like a reverberating drum in her ear. Every creature and living thing had gone silent. Not a blade of grass moved, not even an ant, not even a bird chirping could be heard even in the distance for miles. Not even a hoof moved on soft grass, nor a butterfly fluttering. It was just the booming sound of silence. Some of the sun's brightness had dimmed, but there was no covering of grey clouds, not even one cloud pillowed the sky. The sky was as empty of any heavenly adornment as the cold goodbye of a spurned lover was empty of warmth. The sky was darkening overhead, and it was having a flow effect on the surrounding environment. As the brightness of the day was morphing from its brilliant blue, allowing itself with hopeless abandon to disintegrate shade by shade into a deep and dark pallor of greys. The shade that the birch trees threw over the ground grew into shapes of black, dark silhouettes and removed any sight of the ground and grass with which they covered. The shadows of the trees looked like black tree shape holes that creviced the earth. Brooke did not feel like she could even move one muscle, and this was not for lack of trying. They remained like stones. Brooke understood and comprehended the depth of heavy control that this weightless shadow seemed to carry. It was in control of all that surrounded it, and this was the reason her body was enveloped and stricken into position, along with her fear. The one thing Brooke was sure of, though, was that this thing was etching ever closer to her. It was even momentarily stopping every few meters, as if it were observing her, and then it would move a little closer to her and repeat this process. The fine hairs on her arms and the nape of her neck were standing on end. Every time the thing stopped, she felt her body get a little stiffer and the muscles a little heavier, like it was trying to simultaneously both observe and understand her, as well as exert its control over her body and mind. It was willing her to relax. She could almost feel it like a gentle caressing her, even at a distance away, that she could still sense its call. It knew that her breathing was erratic and without words, but through her senses, it was willing her to be still and calm, and offering to Brooke, by its sheer presence, the opportunity to be relieved of her stress. It would offer secrets and gifts and remove her fear. She would allow it into her body, and then her mind, and then into her heart. Her skin crawled, and she felt 1 or 2 beads of sweat fall from her forehead. She felt repelled, but at the same time allured by this thing, very curious about it. She wanted to know what it was, and where it came from, and why it was here. Her curiosity was being allured by its strange seductiveness. Somewhere in the depths of her mind, she could desperately try to fight the mental desire to submit to this thing, even though it seemed to have hold of her body. Her body felt shackled and weighted down, and she felt captive on the spot where she stood. Brooke fought to maintain her presence of mind, and had resolved within herself not to give in, but concrete herself into resistance, come what may. She wasn't giving in, and she could hear the thing calling to her to let herself come to a place of submission and peace and stillness by way of its help. Through her resolve and sheer will and determination, Brooke fought to ignore the fear and absurdity that was trying to envelop her. She was choosing not to become its prey, or worse, its captive. Highly aware that her breathing was shallow and laboured because of the damp air pressure and what felt like a lack of oxygen, despite the surrounding forest, Brooke focused on her own breath. She could not currently muster the control to calm her shallow breathing down, and she felt so very, very cold, and everything has gone so dark and grey. In fact, in only moments the darkness had got so palpable she could not see even an inch in front of her and felt panic begin to set in. but her instincts told her to be calm and show no fear of surrender, even if she couldn't move under the weight of this thing's spell. And try as she might, she could not even move a centimeter anyway. She felt compelled to obey this instinct of fighting for the battle of her mind and body, and it turned out that this wasn't so hard, even if her body felt stiff like a statue. Her physical bodily imprisonment allowed her to concentrate on calming herself and work on steadying her breath without the impingement of her body, which may, if in full working order, which would have caused her by natural instinct, a desire to flee on foot which could be disastrous. This natural inclination to flee would have left her in a state of flurry, and without focus or control she would have panicked, and who knows what would have happened then. This ominous presence would soon be up close and personally declare itself to her and her surroundings in the form of a cloud which possessed the colour and the depth of any ordinary shadow. The cloud continued gliding along as a moving presence that never touched the ground, and it was etching ever so slowly toward her. It loomed as a sole entity, with its expanse sheltering the trees to their tops and in width. Its expanse was as wide as her peripheral sight could see. She had no nerve to look left nor right to observe its reach. It was so big and seemed to be getting larger. The present darkness had her transfixed, and she was guessing and counting in her head how many seconds it was away from her. She guessed 30 seconds, 0.29 seconds. It didn't seem to consume anything in its path. Nothing appears to be dying, though. It is just passing through objects, whatever was in its way. 22 seconds, though it did seem to be beelining straight for me. But I know that already. 17 seconds. Keep calm and breathe slowly, Brooke. Brooke managed a small exhale, and she forced her eyes shut for a moment, willing herself to keep her composure despite her breathing being frenetic and shallow. And she did manage to keep her composure before she opened her eyes again, and the looming cloud stood centimeters away from her. Stubbornly refraining from submitting to surprise and a little shock, she could feel the coldness and darkness of the presence right up against her skin, and she thought she had grossly miscalculated its distance away from her. Either that or the presence had gathered considerable pace while her eyes were closed. Anyway, it was right in front of her, and now and still hovering off the ground. The presence of it was stifling, and her breathing grew a little more erratic, and even a little more shallow still. She felt like all that she could breathe in was vaporless air that emitted from the cloud, and her instinct told her that the cloud somehow knew this, and took delight knowing that it was the only air that she could breathe. The greyness was much bigger than she was in both height and width, at least 3 lengths of her height, and about 10 of her wide, and she resolved within herself not to be intimidated. She could detect no eyes in the presence, but she could feel it watching and observing, and she was sure that it felt like it was trying to absorb and understand her presence and who she was. This presence which loomed gave off a very cold aura. She could feel the chilly dampness of it under her skin, though the cloud shadow thing did not touch her. She felt its coldness permeate her bones. The presence just hovered only centimeters from her, and she stayed still unable to move a muscle. She stood frozen, focusing her mind on keeping her composure, ignoring the soreness and stiffness that was taking hold over her muscles and tendons. It was a sole entity, this much Brooke knew, and was without a puppeteering master as one would assume a shadow would have. She couldn't decide if it was a cloud or shadow that hovered before her, as it gave the essence of either or both. I'm delirious, I must be. I'm not. It's my only explanation. She could feel that it had a pulse and heartbeat, and she could feel the pulse of this presence now permeate through her skin, entering into the muscles in her limbs and torso. It was like a slow, rhythmic vibration and the beat of a very gentle drum that was trying to sync with her own pulse and heartbeat. She could feel its desire to connect with her, though the presence could not quite manage to engage with its desired target. Brooke could feel it wanting to synchronize with her own heartbeat, but she knew if she let her heart pump in the same rhythm as this entity, that it would tie her to itself, and Brooke instinctively knew that would not be good. So, she quickened her heartbeat by increasing her breathing, which was the one thing she felt that she still had control over. It was easy to create such erratic, short, sharp breaths in this atmosphere, and she instinctively knew that her breathing and heartbeat were in a natural and stark contrast to this thing, which seemed to favor long, slow, and labored movements of breath and heart. She was hoping that her instinct was correct, and that this was the defense she had against the darkness. The girl did not know how she knew this, but she did, and chose not to question her own instinct, as she had nothing else tangible to rely on. That awful foreign breath of the presence within her quickened also. Her response was to hold her breath and exhale slowly and hold her breath again, and she had just enough gas in her tank to oppose the heartbeat of this abhorrence that wanted to meld and connect itself so desperately with her. The very presence so dark within her was quickly learning how to read her internal body clock and was on the throngs of matching its breath and heartbeat to hers. Something inside of her remembered, probably instinct again, that she could adjust her ribcage to expand and her lungs strengthen, just like what happened in the ocean. She knew she could hold her breath for a while, which she did, and this gave her enough traction to give very short, sharp, and fierce breathing patterns. She hoped that this would work on land. The presence, who preferred slow and rhythmic patterns, could not match the quick, sudden change of Brooke's heart and lung movements. It had worked! And then in one instant, the present darkness understood Brooke's resistance, and the fact that its own pulses could not match the skirting of Brooke's pulses understood its defeat and retreated. And in one moment, the darkness was gone. The sun was shining, the temperature was rising, the birds were chirping, the sky was a rich blue again, and most importantly, and in this same instant, Brooke was not cold anymore. Brooke barely registered that she no longer needed to relieve herself because she vaguely felt a warm trickle down the inside of her leg. Her knees were weak, and her muscles felt like jelly, and she collapsed into her own urine on the ground. Her face was etched in fear, her forehead wrinkled up, her mouth seemed stuck in a position of open-mouthed shock, and her haunted eyes staring at nothing before she passed out for an indeterminate amount of time.